In today's show, we're talking Toronto Raptors with the host of the Locked On Raptors podcast, Sean Woodley. Michael Bolton is here.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com and at Yahoo Sports Australia. And you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_Beeble and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. We're going to be talking Toronto, a bit of a change with the Raptors this season, and despite the apparently somewhat common belief, I don't hate the Raptors, not even the slightest bit. They're actually one of my favorite teams, but apparently people think that I hate them, and I don't know why. Anyway, we're going to talk Toronto Raptors today with Sean Woodley, so hey, no more mucking around. Let's get straight into it. All right, here he is, the host of the Locked On Raptors podcast, helping me work through this Raptors rotation. It is Sean Woodley. Welcome back to the show, Sean.
Thanks for having me back, Josh. It's good to chat with you. The new season coming up. It's quite exciting.
It is very exciting. Very excited to have this season. We're sort of getting back to normal with the NBA now, and I'm not sure that things are necessarily normal with the Raptors, but at least one thing, Sean, is it looks like they'll be playing in Canada this year.
Yeah, that is the biggest thing, right? Last year was such a write-off. It was just tricky, man. Like, I don't know how much you could really put stock into what you saw last season from the Raptors. They spoke a lot about the mental toll that it took on the team. They spoke a lot about the fact that there were no fans. Toronto has this sort of, renowned home court. When they were playing home games last year, they were getting booed by the opposing team to the point where they stopped letting fans in the building for a while. It just was a rough situation. So I'm glad they're back. I'm glad I get to go to and cover games once again, but I also think it's just going to kind of let the team play a little bit more settled. I don't think we'll see some start like we saw last season. Obviously, maybe not the same quality of team we thought last year's team was going to be with no Kyle Lowry, but I think, a 2-8 start where they look completely discombobulated, I think is probably out of the question, just because they're going to be at home. They're going to have their stuff in the right place. They're not going to be playing out of hotels. Half the guys didn't even have houses when the season started last year. So that should be a pretty big boost just to start the season for the Raptors this season.
Speaking of starting the season, what is your opening night starting five with the caveat that we'll talk about Pascal in a second, with the caveat that Pascal is playing? So I guess their best case scenario starting five for let's say opening night, or let's say 1st of December perhaps, when Pascal might be back, which we'll talk about soon.
Yeah, I'd say the ideal starting five, the sort of one you can project in with a healthy Pascal Siakam, is Fred VanVleet, Gary Trent Jr., OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, and Khem Birch. You could quibble with whether Trent should start or come off the bench. He was sort of up and down in his time with the team last season. There were injuries. They were playing out, this sort of COVID-ridden garbage time of the season. So you don't know how much to put stock into his rougher shooting numbers. But, I think you could talk yourself into Goran Dragic maybe starting just as kind of like an extra bit of ball handling, especially if Siakam's going to be out. But, if all things are equal, this will be the five. They just invested in Gary Trent Jr. What is it, $17 million a year, $18 million a year? All these other guys are core pieces they've either recently paid or just paid this offseason in the case of Khem Birch. I think that is the starting five you can pretty comfortably pencil in. And it looks like a pretty reasonable starting five as well. A good mix of, shooting. You've got, an actual center. Sorry to your countryman Aaron Baines, but it's nice to have a dude, my countryman Khem Birch, who is a little bit more competent at NBA center things these days. And then you have the VanVleet and Anunoby Siakam core of the team, which is really going to be the determining factor of how this team, lines up and shakes out in the East.
I think you bring up a good point there about ball handling. Now, I don't really think that Dragic is a starting caliber full-time guy anymore. But if Siakam is out, you don't want Trent dribbling and distributing. You don't really want Birch doing that at all. Siakam's replacement would probably be Chris Boucher, although if they did put Scotty Barnes in there, at least he could handle. You don't want Anunoby running things significantly that way. So it does put a little bit of strain on VanVleet in that scenario. I guess you could see it happen that way. Is there any chance that maybe instead of Dragic that they put, say, Malachi Flynn in there after his, I think pretty impressive end to last season and pretty solid summer league?
Yeah, you could in theory see them start with like a VanVleet, Flynn, Trent backcourt. They've not been afraid to play small in the past. They started Kyle Lowry and Fred VanVleet together the last two seasons. Like, they're comfortable doing that. I think they'd like to get away from that. And we've seen just sort of with their offseason moves and the way they've talked about how much they love having dudes who are 6'9" and long and defensively talented in their lineup. It doesn't strike me as a team that's going to be, going back to playing small anytime soon. So, if we do see Flynn, that might mean Trent goes to the bench. That leaves the bench without a lot of ball handling. I think if Boucher just swaps in for Siakam in that starting five you see on the screen there, that's not the most ball handling heavy lineup, of course, but Boucher at least will finish plays off. You might be able to do a little bit with Kem Birch, maybe work out of the post a little bit. He kind of showed some passing chops last season that I don't think anyone really expected. Anunoby is going to be asked to carry a lot of offensive burden this season, so it might be kind of a trial by fire thing with him to see if his playmaking can kind of scale up. But yeah, it's going to be tricky without Siakam early on. He's the best player on this team. It's unquestionable. And not having his playmaking and his scoring is going to be tricky. I think Boucher kind of does a good enough job replicating the scoring at least. And then the playmaking, we'll see. It might just be a team that has to run down other teams' throats and defend like maniacs and force a bunch of turnovers in order to get offense.
In terms of a bench group, Sean, a lot of these names we've mentioned already. I think they're pretty obvious. You've got Dragic, you've got Flynn, Scotty Barnes will be in there as well, Boucher. And some of these guys, we could see Dragic, Flynn, Barnes, and Boucher. We've mentioned all of them as potential starting options. And then lastly, you've got Precious Achiuwa there as the backup center. We know, well, from afar, and you can confirm or deny this, we know that Nick Nurse seems to really detest playing Chris Boucher at center. Does not trust doing that at all for any long periods of time. And now that Achiuwa's there, is that, assigning Boucher basically to just being a full-time, I guess, 4?
It might be. I think it depends on the way Achiuwa looks coming out. I mean, he looked awesome in Summer League, and maybe he stakes claim to that, 5 spot, full-time off the bench, and I'd be totally okay with that. I think he kind of profiles more as a center than Boucher does. I think he's shorter than Boucher, but he's like twice as thick as Boucher, which is kind of important.
You could probably bench press him.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could see Boucher close games at center. If they need some extra scoring punch and assuming full health, I could see them closing with, Van Vliet, Trent or Dragic, and then Anunoby, Siakam, Boucher at the 5. I think you can kind of get away with Boucher playing the 5 in that situation because he has some other size, got some other rebounding out there. You can kind of just play a switchable defense and, not so much worry about who's your sort of mainstay rim protector. But yeah, I think the signing of Birch to a new deal and bringing in Achiuwa kind of suggests that they think Boucher's best as a 4. I think Boucher's best as a 4 as well. If you think about last season when the Raptors were actually playing well before COVID took them out of the season, the best stretch of the season came with Boucher coming off the bench next to Aaron Baines, the aforementioned Aaron Baines. And it was actually the best we saw from both of those guys at times last season. Those guys kind of playing in a Killer Bees 4-5 situation. Boucher's not forced to play and hang around with centers. He can, pull 4s out and stretch the floor quite a bit. I just think he works better as a 4. Honestly, Chris Boucher is like a shooting guard who's just tall. And that's just it's a difficult thing to figure out where he slots in. But the beautiful thing about this Raptors team, or the weird thing about the Raptors team that's coming up this year, is I don't really think positions are going to matter all that much. I think they're going to play Scotty Barnes at center. I think they'll play OG at center. I think, Boucher, Birch, Achiuwa will all play there. They're going to play some funky-ass lineups this season. It's going to be a lot of fun, but I think it could be tricky to kind of peg down which position each guy's playing the majority of his minutes at. Yeah,
positions are passé, but I'll tell you what else is passé, Sean, and that is excessive sweating. Nobody wants that problem. Whether you're at work, at school, in a social function, you don't want to be worried about, hey, if I lift my arm up to point over there, are people going to see a swimming pool? Nobody wants that. Sweatblock is the answer. This is actually, at the moment, Sean, the #1 product on Amazon this week. That's amazing stuff. It is doctor created. It is doctor recommended. The Sweatblock wipes. You wipe them under your arm before you go to bed. Wake up the next morning, have a shower, go off and do what you need to do, and you're covered for up to 7 days. That is remarkable coverage from Sweatblock. These have been around for ages. They've been over 10 years, 13,000 reviews. You've seen them on Rachel Ray. They're available at Amazon. They're available at CVS. But you can also get them now for 20% off at sweatblock.com, but only if you use our promo code, which is locked on. They also have the dry shirt guarantee. If it doesn't keep you dry, you get your money back. How good is that? 20% off, dry shirt guarantee. Go to sweatblock.com, use the promo code locked on, and save 20% on Sweatblock. This is also something that people might find common. You have this issue of you watch your live sport somewhere, and then you log in and you watch your shows somewhere else, and then you watch your highlights on your phone, and then you borrow someone else's login to watch the other shows that you need to watch. There's just so much stuff. There's so much clutter. There's so much confusion. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all of that entertainment you love without the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It is called Direct TV Stream, and it brings your live TV and on-demand shows together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and TV shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes and no need to buy another device ever again. And the best part, there is no annual contract, so get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directtv.com. That's directtv.com. Compatible device required and content varies by package. Pascal Siakam. Injured shoulder, torn labrum, like every other player in the NBA who suffered an off-season injury, apparently. What is the expected return time frame for Siakam?
It's kind of tough because we haven't heard anything really since he had surgery. There's been no updates. I'd expect we'll get some now as players are filtering into Toronto here and training camp's getting ready to get going in a couple of weeks. But, I think the going sort of guess is about a month, like mid-November, late November. If you can get back by then, I think you're happy. If it gets into December, then I think that's kind of, on the long end of things for sure. There's a world in which maybe early November he gets in. We don't really have an update on him whatsoever. But yeah, I don't think it'll be until November at some point that we see Siakam in the lineup, which is obviously going to make things really difficult for the Raptors in the first part of the season, as we talked about off the top.
Yeah, it's going to be hard because Siakam gets, I think, a lot of unwarranted hate. They're expecting him maybe to be something that he isn't. But I thought that there were times last season, in a really trying season, that he played at a really high level and developed so many things in his game. The shooting is always going to be a bit wonky, but his ability to be a creator improves significantly. His defensive numbers have taken steps back as his offensive load has increased, but that happens to basically everybody. There's not many people. It happened to Kawhi Leonard. We've seen that as his offensive role has increased. He's not that level of defender. He gets by a little bit on reputation as a defender these days. Not that he's bad, but he's not the number one guy anymore. And Siakam's seen that drop off, but it gets held against him quite a bit. I think that that's going to translate to him being underrated significantly in fantasy again this year, just because that first season's out. And I am always skeptical of getting guys who are going to miss the beginning of the year, but when they come in with a shoulder problem, it's not a lower body injury. So he should be, in terms of easing back in, it shouldn't be too much of a long process when he comes back, Sean.
Yeah, I would hope so as well. And yeah, just to go to your point of, Siakam is kind of slept on. I think he's getting to the point where he's like one of the most underrated players in basketball almost, because people look at the bubble situation where he looked terrible against the Celtics in the playoffs, and then they come out to start 2-8 last year, and he has a couple of misses on big potential game-winning buckets, and it's just like, oh, books closed, Pascal Siakam's bad now, and then he just didn't watch the rest of the season because, hey, look, if you weren't watching the Raptors last season, I get it. They were a nightmare to watch. It was a horrible season. Everything was terrible. Everyone was sad. It sucked, but Pascal was legitimately good for long stretches of last season. The playmaking you mentioned, it's not just like he's doing it in one way. He's running pick and roll. He's doing it from the post. He's doing it as a short roll guy in a pick and roll as a screener. Like, he does it in a lot of ways. He does it on the run as well. He's a really good playmaker, and that has, I think, only improved now that he's, been through 2 years as sort of a top option for this team, and that was super notable. The shooting, that was really the only thing that was different about Pascal Siakam last season. If he hits 36% of his threes like he did the year before, you're looking at the exact same output, basically, in terms of points. And when you throw in the defense, you throw in the rebounding, like, he's just a really good player. He's he drives positive play. The team was a nightmare without him on the floor last season. They were a positive team with him on the floor, like 3 or 4 points per 100 possessions, outscoring opponents when he was out there. In the back part of the season, when he wasn't around, they were getting bludgeoned like 12 points per 100. It wasn't even close. By far the biggest sort of driver of positive play when on the floor, and the biggest, detractor from positive play when he was off last season. So yeah, Pascal's really good. When he's back, he's going to assume that number one role. He has more shooters around him this season as well. I think that's an important thing. He averaged 4.5 assists last season when he was oftentimes kicking out to like Stanley Johnson. Stanley Johnson's not on the team anymore. He's kicking out to Gary Trent Jr., which, say what you will about Gary Trent Jr., the dude shoots threes a lot, and he shoots them quite well. And you have Fred VanVleet, an excellent catch and shoot guy. If sort of the burden of the offense shifts more towards Pascal and away from Fred, that's going to open up more off-ball opportunities for Fred through Pascal. OG's a 40% three-point shooter. It's just a team that has a lot of good shooters that weren't available last season, and I think that really hurt Siakam's, not just the playmaking, but also he would go to the basket with 3 dudes on him because the other guys around him were Stanley Johnson and Yuta Watanabe, and it's just not really something a defense is game planning for, and you saw a lot of, double, triple teams, and honestly, I think if you look at last season for Siakam, if you just have a different outcome on 2 or 3 of the potential game winners that he missed, there were like 4 or 5 that were just kind of just rimmed out or whatever it was. If those go the other way 2 out of 5 times, we're talking about Siakam entirely differently. It's just those sort of flashpoint moments that people look at and say, well, he must be bad now, and all he does is spin. If you watch the full season, you'd be pretty excited about Pascal Siakam coming into this season because he's very obviously the best player on this Raptors team. I don't even think it's really a conversation right now.
I could have had a conversation about him and Fred VanVleet, but let's talk about Fred VanVleet, who moves from being a guy who was the secondary ball handler, backup point guard, I guess, as well as the starting shooting guard, but probably now has to transition to being the full-time point guard with Kyle Lowry gone. Like we've thrown up different options. Maybe Dragic starts, maybe Flynn can get in there and play and put VanVleet back into that role. But how can he handle that role? Let's assume, because the probably in 70% of all alternate variant universes, it's Trent and VanVleet in that backcourt, and we know who the point guard is out of that group. So how does Fred handle that job of now being the starting point guard? What does that mean for his game? Like, his overall field goal percentage was pretty rough last season. I thought overall he still plays well. He's a really, really tenacious defender, great shot blocker for a guard. His passing's pretty good, but how does he handle that switch in role now?
Yeah, I mean, you saw that responsibility kind of funneled his way as the season went along last season. I mean, Lowry played like 7 games after the trade deadline. And Fred, when he was healthy, he was playing the lion's share of the minutes as the lead point guard. Look, I don't think any ideal scenario has Fred as being like, run every single possession. You don't want him being Chris Paul for you necessarily because he can't score at the basket. We've seen that before. And I don't think that's a skill coming around anytime soon. He's a 6-foot dude who I think is generously listed as 6 foot, and he just doesn't have much of a bag around the basket. Where it's going to be important for him is, can he work on like the pull-up mid-range game? We saw that a little bit last year, kind of tapered off after a really nice start to it. If he can find ways to score from like 6 to 8 feet, I think that opens things up for him. But it's just, he's never going to be a guy that you want running 100% of your possessions, just because he's not quite the guy who can kind of break a defense down. That said, he's like a wonderful pull-up three-point shooter. He scored 54 points in a game last season. He clearly has that in his sort of repertoire. But I think what you'd like to see if you're the Raptors this year, maybe this hurts his sort of playmaking totals and things like that, but I think the thing you want to see is, hopefully OG can take on some of that offensive burden. Hopefully Malachi Flynn can take on some of that as well, because Fred is best when he's off the ball. Think about the run to the championship in 2019. His best moments were when he was hovered around a really good team and he was just like banging in 14 of 17 threes against the Milwaukee Bucks to push him through to the finals. Like, that's the best version of Fred VanVleet. And it's interesting too, because I think, Fred got a lot better last season in ways that probably don't really matter to fantasy players. He got really, really good in terms of just like the Kyle Lowry stuff. If I'm sort of doing a broad sort of terminology for it, it's the stuff that doesn't show up on a stat sheet really. It's just the kind of like intangible, the sort of driving positive play, that type of stuff. I mean, he usually had pretty bad on-off numbers until last year, where he kind of resembled Lowry in a lot of ways in terms of how important he was to the team and the lineups he played in. So that's super valuable, and I think he's going to be a good guy to have on the floor for the Raptors. I think he'll drive positive play. But in terms of like an uptick from numbers last season with the new sort of responsibility, I don't think we're going to see a ton of it, just because I think some of that playmaking burden will be dispersed throughout the team. And I think we could see, some of the warts in his game kind of exposed a little bit if he has too much of an offensive burden kind of running every possession for the team.
Very important question for you, Sean. Do you know how to fix your own car?
Oh, God, no. Absolutely not. I know who you're about to talk about. These people have saved me so many times because I'm an idiot when it comes to cars.
All right, so if you are looking for parts for your car and you don't know what you're doing and you don't want to have to pay more money, why would you go to a local chain auto parts store? That seems ridiculous. You would go to Rock Auto, because they have all the parts that you need for your car or truck, and you don't have to deal with going to a store, waiting in line, often intimidating questioning, and higher prices. Rock Auto is an online family business that have been serving auto parts customers for the last 20 years, whether it's brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, or even new carpet. Whatever part you need for your car or truck, Rock Auto has you covered. You wouldn't spend 30, 50, 70, 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership. That's ridiculous. No one wants to do that. So go to rockauto.com, browse their expansive catalog where every part that you probably need for your car or truck is right there. And in there, how did you hear about us box? Right, Locked On, so that they know that we sent you. Rock Auto, amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. I've got one more question for you. Sean.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to find what I'm looking for. I've got a new setup here. And sometimes I'm a little bit off in what I'm doing. Where is it? There it is.
But what about scarves?
OG.
Balenciaga
Stop
ones.
OG. You better stop OG.
OG Anunoby. Now, at the end of last season, OG, they just said, well, OG historically has been like this, let's say like an Otto Porter-ish type offensive role. Have your 16% usage, spot up for three, do that efficiently and concentrate on defense. And at the end of last season, basically it seemed, from the outside, and the numbers bear this out, they said, OG, we want you to do more. Can you just ramp up your usage and become more of an offensive focal point? The usage went up, and he said, sure, and he did it at the same efficiency. So you've mentioned it a couple of times now, so I'm assuming the answer to this question is yes. We're all assuming that Nurse is just going to say, well, keep doing that, OG. We want your offense to push up and to be an above-average offensive contributor and to be more of a go-to scorer when you were like a fifth option in the past.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it, like you said, after they traded Norm Powell last season, those possessions had to go somewhere because Norm was shooting like 35 times a game or something, if I recall what he was doing with the team before he got dealt. And OG soaked up a lot of that usage, and he did it, as you said, basically not losing any efficiency whatsoever. It's difficult to do. It was 20 games. It was the end of the season. I'm not sure how much you buy into it. I actually talked about this at length on an episode of my podcast last week. It's hard to say whether or not you can buy into that, but I think they're going to see what he can do. They're going to test his limits, especially when Siakam's out early on. Like, you could see some pretty crooked shooting lines from OG, just because I would imagine he's going to get a pretty high usage without a ton of support around him. But like, that might be kind of a nice trial by fire before kind of settling into like a second option role when Pascal gets back. I think OG is primed for like a legitimate breakout. He has a lot in his bag. He showed a lot last season in terms of, his dribble drive game. He can just like bludgeon dudes in the post. Like, he'll kind of drive and then improvise a post up, and then no one stands a chance. He's always been a really good off-ball scorer, whether it's, 3-point shooting in the corners or above the break, or as a cutter with those sort of patented chin-up dunks he'll do from underneath the basket. Like, he is a really exciting piece for this team. And honestly, I think he's the most important player for the Raptors, not just, in terms of wins and losses this season, but in terms of like the trajectory of the team. If OG levels up and is like a go-to wing scorer, you're sitting there really happy with what you've got with the Raptors. If not, then there's probably going to be some tougher questions to ask next year. I think they're going to give him all the opportunity to do it. I would expect him to average north of 20 points a game. He was at about 18.5 in the back part of last season after, I think, March 1st was the cutoff that I was kind of looking at. He averaged, 18 and like 5 and 3 or something like that. I think the big thing with OG is you would expect there's going to be some drop off in the efficiency at some point, right? If he levels up to a 25% usage, there's no way he's going to keep up a 60% true shooting, just considering where he's at in terms of his overall bag. He's still got to work on the mid-range game. He's still got to work on his, just overall sort of fluidity as a ball handler and as a scorer. The thing that I think could help get back some of that efficiency is the free throw line. And he's just never been a guy who gets to the line a lot. I think he averaged like 2.4 attempts a game last season. His free throw rate plus, like the Basketball Reference adjusted, was like an 80 last season when the league average is 100. I think he's going to have to be a lot better than that this season for a lot of reasons, but mostly just for his own efficiency's sake. And he's got it in him. Like I said, he's like built like an absolute tank. He, in theory, can finish through contact and sort of absorb contact and still score. He hasn't really shown it before. He gets kind of like spread eagle when dudes are around. He'll try to go around guys as opposed to through them, which I think if anyone can go through guys, it's probably him. So, yeah, that's going to be a sort of big key swing factor for me. We improved his free throw percentage last season pretty significantly, up to like 78, 79% after being really rocky in his first 3 seasons. So that was encouraging. It's just a matter of that free throw volume going up. And if he does that, I really think, you're looking at a potential most improved type guy this season. I think by season's end, we're probably looking at OG as the second best player on this Raptors team. And, there's an outside chance, the 100th percentile outcome where he's the best player on this team. And you're kind of looking at, oh God, like look at this sort of wing monster they have going forward. I don't think it's going to be quite that successful. There's going to be a lot of growing pains, but I think, a 20-point a game season for OG is very much on the table this year.
You just spoiled my last question, and that was, I was going to say that a couple of years ago, maybe after their first season, I said I think that long-term OG is going to be the better player between him and Pascal Siakam. And it looked pretty iffy, at first, especially when OG had that issue where, the season where his father passed away and he had the appendicitis and he was completely lost. Yeah. And it's just like, oh, Jesus, like he looks off, right? It looks bad. I stuck with it. Said, let's see how we go. And then I'm still having some of that hope that, because if that offense does come around, he's an elite defender. And the position that he plays, if doing that at the 3 versus doing it at the 4 is significantly more important as well. So if you're able to do that, then I think that is a distinct possibility. You said it's 100th percentile outcome. I'm going to give him a little bit more of a chance to get to that number. I still think it's possible that he can become the best player on this team, and I'm pretty excited to see what he does now that he is going to get the ball in his hands more. Of course, Sean, you'll have all of the Raptor stuff covered for us. If there is some sort of maybe Goran Dragic trade coming up, we'll get all the info from you over on the Locked On Raptors podcast in the coming weeks through preseason into the regular season back in Toronto. Thanks for coming on Locked On Fantasy with me.
Of course, man, anytime.
And that'll do it for today's show. Don't forget to follow this podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and on the Odyssey app on YouTube. Give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below. We'll be back later on with a fantasy preview for the Raptors. I'm looking more at busts and sleepers and ADPs and all that sort of stuff, so stay tuned for that. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.